Open, outspoken, it's ophthalmology off the grid, an honest look at controversial topics in the field. I'm Blake Williamson. Welcome to another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid. In this episode, my co-host, Dr. Tal Raviv, and I are joined by Dr. Graham Barrett, a world-renowned ophthalmologist from Australia. Together, we talked to Dr. Barrett about his autonomous set of IOL formulas, the Barrett Suite, and his process in designing his own IOL. Coming up on Off the Grid.
Support for this podcast comes from Bryn Mawr Communications. BMC produces a number of informative podcast series spanning a variety of topics in ophthalmology. Discover a new show at itube.net/podcasts.
Welcome to another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid, and I am pumped to be back with my fellow co-host, the one and only Tal Raviv. Tal, how you doing? How's New York City?
I'm doing good this week. I took the subway to work this past week, and compared to the past year and a half, it was packed. School's back, work's back. It's like a new era, and I hope it stays.
That's good news, man. Yeah, I went to see the LSU football team play in Tiger Stadium, and it was great to be back in a full stadium and no mask. We had to show our vaccine cards and stuff like that to get in, but it was a full stadium. I brought my 6-year-old with me. It's great to be getting back to life as we once knew it. Hopefully, a little bit, kind of, sort of. So with this episode, we thought, what a cool guest it would be to have Graham Barrett on, all the way from Australia. So I just thought that maybe you could introduce Dr. Barrett and get us started.
Well, thank Blake. We all know of Dr. Barrett. He's world-renowned ophthalmologist. He's from Perth, Australia. He, of course, is perhaps most well-known for his eponymous set of IOL formulas, the Barrett Suite, which we'll get into. But he's won just about every award there is in international ophthalmology. And I first met him on the lecture circuit, but I was honored to have him as a visiting professor at the New York Eye and Ear a few years back and spent some time with him. And Graham, it's great to have you on. How are you doing?
Great to see you, Tal. I remember that visit very well, and nice to catch up again.
We'd love to start out by asking you things maybe you don't get asked on the, we're going to go backwards in time a little bit. Tell us a little bit about, I presume you grew up, I know you went to medical training in Australia, growing up in Australia, what it was like and how you became, a doctor and an ophthalmologist.
So actually my background's more varied, Tal, because I was born in the UK, and then my parents migrated to South Africa. So I went to med school in Johannesburg. And then when I graduated, 40 years plus now, my wife and I immigrated to Australia. So I have a multifaceted background and accent, I guess, as well.
That makes sense. So I was way off on everything, but at least, did you do residency in Perth?
Yes, I did all my ophthalmology
Okay.
In Australia. And I spent... I did a fellowship in the US with Jim McCulley in about 87.
And tell us a little bit about, for those of us listening, that maybe Australia is not something that we know much about. What's it been like under COVID? We know that Australia and New Zealand went for a zero COVID policy, which in the early days, we were looking at you guys having a normal life thinking this is great. On the other hand, maybe there was more shutdowns that are pretty severe. Tell us a little bit of what it's been like.
Well, you describe it well, but it's changed in the past few months because it's a bit like the tale of two cities now, because the East Coast is gone beyond that zero COVID. They couldn't manage to deal with a COVID outbreak with Delta, which started a few months ago. So they're having in Sydney, well, over 1,000 cases a day, which for us is huge. Whereas on the West Coast, so we're a continent away, basically, we still have no COVID and we have no lockdown and we have no restrictions, masks or anything. But during that time period, you may recall, I don't know, several months ago, we had one case and we locked down completely for one case. But a week later, we opened up, and that's what it's been like. But I mean, we've had only probably 10 days, maybe a bit longer, of total lockdown, which sounds wonderful, and it is, but there's a sense of apprehension now, because obviously you can't continue with COVID zero indefinitely, because at some point in time it will arrive. And everyone's fairly pedestrian in their rush to vaccinate, unlike in the Sydney, Melbourne, where there is an outbreak, where the vaccine rate is now, heading for 70, 80%. We're taking our time, partly because we bet on the wrong vaccine. So we thought AstraZeneca was going to be the answer, and we produce it in large volumes in Australia. That was the strategy. And of course, that was all done before some of the very rare but issues occurred with AstraZeneca. So people have been waiting for their Pfizer supplies, which are arriving now. So we'll catch up, but it's a very contentious issue because, we look at the East and think, well, you didn't lock down properly, and now you've put us in the situation. And they're saying, well, when are you going to allow people from New South Wales to travel to WA? Because at the moment, you can't get into WA and we can't get out. So it's very restrictive. And you haven't seen me at ASCRS or ESCRS. I simply can't get permission to do so. I can, but then I've got to be prepared not to come back for 3 months, something like that. It's very restrictive.
Yeah, I was going to ask, it's kind of like here in the United States, we have parts of the states where there's COVID outbreaks and parts of the states where there's barely nothing. So it's kind of similar to us. How has it been with you during lockdown, not having to travel and not having to, go to all these meetings? It's kind of nice to be able to do some of the webinars we're doing now. I think we're kind of getting a little bit faded out on them, but my family has certainly enjoyed it to a large extent. But being on an island, way out where you guys are, is it kind of, are y'all itching to leave and get out and about?
I know exactly what you're saying. And the first 2 months it was novel and I quite enjoyed it and was quite productive doing other things, but it wears off. And I'm missing in particular, the friendships and the people that I meet when I go to meetings like you guys. And yes, I'm ready to recommence.
Well,
enjoying the world again.
Well, we're ready to see you again. Switching gears back to sort of your beginnings before the Barrett Suite and what you're so well known for, at least in my generation of ophthalmologists in our first 5 or 6 years of practice. You were designing IOLs way back when. So I think in 1983, is that when you designed your first IOL? I was born in 1983. I'm not trying to make you feel old, but literally I was born that year. Meanwhile, you were actually designing IOLs. That's amazing. Can you kind of take me back to that time, and where were you in your training, and what made you think that you could design your own IOL?
I look back and now I think, great question. I asked myself that question. What made me think I could? At the time, it seemed obvious that there were limitations, and I was still a resident in ophthalmology. So I began the idea in my first year. I did a talk to my peers on IOLs and the history of IOLs, and became immediately fascinated by that whole topic, and acutely aware of some of the problems, particularly endothelial touch. These were days before viscoelastics, and said, well, if we have a material which damages endothelium, why don't we look at other materials? And that was the genesis for my interest in hydrophilic acrylic implants, which are much more tolerant. And I, found a contact lens manufacturer in Perth. There's only one, of course. And he didn't send me away. And I used to spend 2 afternoons a week when I was supposed to be studying ophthalmology in the lab, designing, working out the process, and published the paper. And then as I was ending my training, we got a call from a company, well, for more than one company, but Alcon, and it just escalated. I don't talk about it much because it's such a out of the box experience. It's almost like a fairy tale. And in fact, the interest of mine in formulae was a consequence of that lens design. So the lens was a different refractive index. It was aconvex, asymmetric, biconvex optic. Haptics didn't look like anything else. And when I began to implant this lens, and you're right, it was 83, and it was actually before the star lens, I had no idea what lens power this was, because it looked like nothing else on the planet. And so it was by necessity, then I said, well, okay, I need a formula where I can put these parameters in. I could make the radii of curvature, the refractive index, and that means you delving into, paraxial ray tracing or thick lens formulae. And that interest, grew, but it was always peripheral. I found it much more exciting on lens design. Phaco became a huge interest, phaco-dynamics, phaco needles, complex cataract surgery, and the formulae was just burning in the background. It wasn't quite macho enough for me. I, didn't really talk about it. But I was using it, obviously, and refining it. And when I had a fellow several years ago, she asked me, well, you're okay, but what about the rest of us? And that made me do something else, which in retrospect, I think really was quite different, in that rather than trying to talk to the various biometry companies, or I said, well, I'll just publish this online and make it freely available. And I had a role for many years as president of APA CRS, and I thought, well, this would be great. So as a society, we're offering something. And so first I added the standard formula, then the True K formula, and the various others. Now, it sounds like I was a marketing genius, but I wasn't. I just thought, yeah, let me make this available. I really had no interest in making any money from it. And now I look and see that models become quite widely used. But that's in a very snapshot, the story of formulae.
That is incredible. I remember hearing about the Barrett formula early on, but it was not on any of our printouts. The first generation biometers didn't have it. And I remember when I first heard about it, I would occasionally go on and log on to the apacrs.org, and I would punch in the numbers. This is going a decade ago or more. And because I read that this was starting to the published studies found that it was good. But was it called the Barrett initially, and then you Barrett Universal, and then you made it the Barrett Universal 2? Tell us about the nomenclature of all that. And I feel like overnight you became a sensation. So it became the formula. I don't know, just maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, it became the number one, that along with maybe, some others we'll talk about. But tell us about that transformation.
Well, at the tender age of about 28 or so, when this was happening, I was too modest to say, I'm going to call this the Barrett formula. So I decided I must have something to call it. So I called it the universal formula. And the idea of universal back in, this is the 80s. I wanted to make a formula that was accurate throughout the axial range length. So maintain its accuracy from short, medium, and long. And that's where the universal came from. And also the fact that, as I said, this was Gaussian optics, so you could put any lens in that formula. You just needed the refractive index and the radii. And that's how I used it initially. And then I realized, my gosh, people don't know these parameters. So I then just assume a biconvex optic, but it's within the formula. It's got all the inputs that you would want to put any lens in without knowing necessarily what the constant was. You could do that. That that's within it. And then, of course, I published this back in late 80s, early 90, and then, it evolved and it got refined and it got improved. And that's when I added 2 to differentiate it perhaps from the early form there. So it became Barrett Universal 2. And now the Universal tends to not necessarily be included. But it's a long road, but it was not intended to be my focus. But it's become probably the most important thing I've done in many respects, because everyone's forgotten, the phaco needles, the lenses, and all those other things, Tal.
Oh, maybe coming back to the future, we'll talk about a lens you may be involved with, but just to finish up the formulas a little bit, there's the Barrett toric calculator, and, besides getting the sphere accurately, getting that toric was a big problem for us for years. Doug Koch helped remind us about posterior corneal astigmatism, but you actually had a formula that figured it out pretty darn well. And correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe it's not, in 2021, going into 2022, is that formula still beat out most objective measurements by our tomographers to this day, or are we getting to the point where we can actually measure it now?
Look, it still is, I think, as accurate. In fact, I'm always looking for ways to improve it. And one of the ways to improve it is to add a measured component to it. So you measure the posterior cornea, but, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but measuring the posterior cornea isn't sufficient. If you base a formula on the measured posterior cornea, you'll only get a modest improvement in your outcomes. So there's more to a toric calculation than that, and you have to take account of that. But you can take that measured posterior cornea and utilize it within the toric calculator if your toric calculator is flexible enough. And there are subgroups where using the Barrett toric calculator with the measured posterior cornea input will actually give you better outcomes than just the pure prediction mode, such as post-refractive and unusual corneas such as keratoconus. But for the average eye, amazingly, the predicted method, so it utilizes a posterior cornea, but it predicts the posterior cornea. But it also accounts for things like tilt and other things which contribute to unexplained astigmatism. That's still, in my hands anyway, superior than directly measuring. But when you use, say, the Barrett TK, it's very confusing because the Barrett TK on the Zeiss, it's not just the Barrett formula with TK. It's not. It's a convenient name for the Barrett toric calculator with the input measured cornea. It doesn't use the TK value, so it can be a bit confusing.
What's that like, working with all those different companies to have this suite on it, right? So I'm guessing there's some type of business relationship where, in order to have the Barrett Suite, they have to form a relationship with your company, and and all these companies want that on their biometers. They want it in their aura. What was that process like? Licensing, what you created for all these different ways that we can, help, give patients better vision.
I had practice. So over the years with lenses and phaco technology and so on, I had lots of experience of working with companies, knocking on their door and saying, please, will you look at this, scribbling on napkins. And this was the greatest fun because they were knocking on my door and saying, can we do it? But
and you would say yes for a modest fee.
I've licensed it. It's complicated enough that you really can't do it without me. So haven't. So I've patented things over the years, but not in this case. And yes, so finally, after many years, a remarkably easy process. And but of course, what happens is you gain relationships over the years, so you have an entrance to companies and to people which you take for granted, but it happens over many years.
Graham, I know the last few years you added obviously the TK, which is on the Zeiss, to get a little better results. And as you mentioned, for post-myopic LASIK, for keratoconus, maybe not the average case yet. You've done your integrated K, we take multiple K measurements because that was a source of error. And I think you've gotten tighter results with that. What's on the horizon? Do you have are you working on the next thing? Can you share anything with us?
I've done it. Been sitting on it for several months. And that's just looking, because the issues are a formula, post-refractive, keratoconus, toric, lens exchange, and working on solutions to all those things. So now I'm going back to the beginning and say, well, okay, it was an open field a decade ago when everyone was using essentially standard formulae, and now the field's getting quite crowded. There's many contenders. It's bewildering, the number. The reality is that we're all hitting a ceiling to some extent, but there's still a distinction between a modern formula and a traditional formula. So what I'd like now to do is keep pushing that boundary. So I have I'm not going to call it BU3. It's just going to be BU2 version 3. and there's many ways that you can push that boundary. And one is just more data. So that will be the first look. The other is including other parameters such as gender. The other thing is, well, how can you more reliably include the features of the lens you're using, not just the constant, a little bit more sophisticated than that, because they have other features than a constant. They have asphericity. The different companies control the optic thickness in a variety of ways, and looking at that in more detail. So that's my next mission. It's more complicated now because I could change the formula as I wanted to over the years. And I just used to change it online, not even mention it, and just refine it. But if you have the formula being used by many people and companies on their barometers, the consequence is greater. So the validation that you require to make sure this is going to offer you an advantage is more difficult. And of course, because things are so good now, you put a lot of work into making it better, and you look at 1,000 hours and say, yes, it is a bit better, but it's so tiny. Do you want to be disruptive? And that's the process I'm going through now.
You mentioned, all the crowded landscape now compared to what there was. The Mount Rushmore of biometry. I feel like you have the Barrett and Hill and Holiday. Would y'all ever get together in the past and get a beer and just talk formulae? Or are y'all friendly, or do you talk about what you're creating? Because so many people look to you guys, for this stuff.
I mean, we are all friendly. It's a very nice group of peers. And, we can enjoy talking to each other because we bore everybody else to death with talking about some of the nuances. But if you ask me, well, why do I think I was successful? One of the ingredients of that is the total isolation of Perth. We are the most isolated capital city in the world. So I grew up and I said, well, what made you think you could make a lens out of a new material or various other things? Well, I live in a world in an intellectual sense, in ophthalmology on my own, even isolated from the East Coast. So I don't have the privilege and advantage of hearing Jack Holliday, every second month presenting his wonderful insights. So what happens, you're thinking on your own, and you're your intellectual sphere is untouched in some respects. So it makes you think differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you ever think about, one of the sort of holy grails of nailing your result, you can have a great biometry and the Ks and the axial length and it's all right on the money, but ELP, lens position, is always kind of that factor at the end. Have you thought about technologies that can sort of make that more standardized so that we can get more LASIK-like outcomes with lens-based surgery, whether it be femto? I know a lot of people believe femto can help with ELP on different lens designs or other things to kind of to kind of stabilize that last sort of fudge factor that we can't quite account for.
Look, we're trying hard. Every new parameter that you introduce, such as measuring the posterior cornea, can potentially help. There may be other parameters that you can measure, such as the lens parameters itself, the thickness and so on, more precisely, even curvature. But if you look at the benefit of these additional parameters, the improvement percentage-wise becomes less and less and less. But I think that's one direction. The other direction is lens design and more precisely entering those parameters in the formulae, either directly or indirectly. And it's not just a matter of saying, well, let's make a lens where the ELP stays fixed, regardless of the power. And I've thought about that. But you don't need to do that. You just need to know how that optic changes as the power range changes. Femto potentially looked interesting, didn't turn out to be that way. One of the challenges we have that we're measuring our success by refraction, which is incredibly noisy anyway. And, it's a huge challenge to make your refraction precise and make it objective. And, if you have a patient and you're measuring down to a quarter diopter or cylinder, I still refract occasionally. And so I have an acute sense of appreciation how difficult that is. You've got to look over the shoulder of your optometrist or technician and tell them their job is not to make you happy and give you wonderful results, but tell it as it is, as Bobby would say. I want to know the refraction. And if there's a quarter diopter cylinder, I want it documented. And if you don't stop refracting at 6.6, you go down to 6.5 or 6.4, because until you get to that level, you haven't got the best refraction. But there's not many centers or I've worked with one guy for so many years and he knows me. And so I have that reliable input. And so how can we do better when sometimes our index of success is somewhat fuzzy? And that's a challenge too.
As I've heard you and Warren Hill, and you're basically sometimes the size of the room is what you're optimizing for in different clinics, things like that, because that makes a difference in the vision, the refraction. As you wrap it up, you started out making lenses, and then you had to make a formula so the lens worked. And it seems like you're coming back to lenses. Tell us a little bit about your latest project. I think you're working with Rayner, is that right? And the newest category of lenses, is that right?
It is, Tal. So look, I've never left lenses. Some of my dreams are about haptics and how to make them better. And I'm working with more than one company and trying to get that perfect haptic. I then, more than 10 years ago, began thinking about optics, although I have thought about it. So many of the things that you see, like the adjustable optic and so on, of course, I've thought about it. Not just me, we all think about it, but thinking about it's one thing, but taking it into practice is another journey. So the one thing I did take into practice was my thoughts on extended depth of focus. I've never been a fan of multifocals, and I'm still not. And I don't use them. I did when they first came out, absolutely. I was one of the first to extend the testing on the 3M, but I left that. And monovision has substituted perfectly for me. But I've always thought, well, yes, it is important to read, and monovision works for me, but how do you take that the next step? How do you enhance that? And that led me to extended depth of focus, which is a common term now, but when I first presented the concept, it wasn't a common term, EDF. And the idea was, how can you add something without detracting too much? And of course, it depends how greedy you are. If you get greedy, you do pay a penalty. And I wanted to say, well, can you get something almost for nothing? And that was extended depth of focus. But I wanted to use it with myopia, with monovision, because if you limit yourself to quality vision, then you're not going to read unaided. You'll get good intermediate, you get a little bit better reading. You have to add some myopia, at least in one eye. And rather than that being kind of an afterthought, you bring out this wonderful lens, and it doesn't work that well, so then the monovision creeps in. You've seen that with accommodative lenses. You're still seeing it with extended depth of focus. But I said, no, from the outset, I recognized this. And I said, well, what method of extended depth of focus best lends itself to monovision or myopia? And it happens to be positive spherical aberration. I actually worked with another company for years on this, which was Hoya, and then eventually began a partnership with Rayner. And so they now have the Rayner EMV, enhanced monovision. You don't have to use it with monovision, of course. You can use it just targeting emetropia. But it just lends itself very well. Extending depth of focus with positive spherical aberration lends itself very well to working synergistically with a level of myopia. Because there's many ways you can extend the depth of focus, of course, as we see. Diffractive optics, phase shift optics, but this is the lens perhaps that you're seeing, and yes, it's FDA approved, and I think they are beginning studies in the US.
That's amazing. That's we're really excited about getting access to that and using that in our patients who are desirous of spectacle freedom. Dr. Barrett, I want to thank you for joining us on Off the Grid. It's been illuminating to listen to you, someone who's been doing these amazing things literally my entire life, and contributed so much to giving us the best refractive outcomes, from the lenses to the formula and everything in between. So, Tal, it was fantastic conversation. Thank you for joining us again. And we hope that you'll come back.
It'll be a pleasure. I enjoy talking about it. It's not often you can talk about things, beyond the things which occupy us on the podium. So I've enjoyed it very much and appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you to Dr. Barrett for joining us on this episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. This has been Ophthalmology Off the Grid. Until next time.